Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for another redraft. With the 2022 NHL Draft's top prospects like Lane Hutson, Logan Cooley, Shane Wright performing really well this season, I decided to go and re-update my 2022 draft rankings to see how they'd look today. And folks, a lot has changed from 3 years ago. So who do I still see as the best players and prospects in the 2022 NHL Draft? Which players have exceeded expectations? Which players are disappointed? Well, today we're going to be going through all the redrafts top 15, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content and draft content just like this all throughout the year. Now, it seems like I need to mention this every single redraft video for the Scrooges out there. Yes, redrafts are not gospel. It's a silly thing to do, whatever you might think. But I do for every single draft class, new rankings every single month, basically on this channel. So if doing monthly draft rankings is okay, but putting out a video reevaluating players 3 years after their draft year with a lot more context and a lot more going on, then I don't know what to say. I like doing redrafts. They're fun, and I think 3 years after a draft, with all that we've seen so far, is enough to get an evaluation on a lot of these guys. Now, this draft is still early enough that there's a lot of prospects on this list that are still in the AHL or other leagues that find their way into the top 15. A lot of these guys, of course, are not even close to being done developing, but I want to get a new look at this 2022 draft because I think a lot has changed since draft day. Now, getting us started inside the top 15 redraft for 2022, we're going to go on to a player that I loved back in his draft year, and I think has progressed pretty well since then, in Brad Lambert of the Winnipeg Jets. A 30th overall pick, but was somebody that was inside my top 5. Now, I wouldn't have him there, obviously, today, but I still think Lambert has done well progressing to the North American game. You can see, especially last year in the AHL, he was fantastic as a rookie. In 64 games, got 55 points, 21 goals. This year, I think he's taken a little bit of a step back, but that's just because he's been up and down throughout the NHL and the AHL level, not really getting comfortable in either. I think by the time next year comes, he will get a solidified spot with Winnipeg, or at least I hope. I think he deserves it, but I think he is a victim of Winnipeg's depth and forward group being so good that his opportunity hasn't quite come yet. But just like a player like Nikita Chibrikov, I think Lambert's going to get a lot of opportunity here soon, and once he does, that skill, that speed is going to be put on display for all to see. Now, going on to number 14, another player that's been up and down between the NHL and the AHL this year, and for different teams, in David Jiricek. Now, he was a player that I wasn't as high on compared to other people in his draft year. I remember a lot of people having him inside their top 3s, and in my case, he was outside of that for me, but still I saw him as a top 10 defensive prospect in that class, and somebody that would fit as a top 4 in the future with his physicality, with some of the power play ability. That's what I thought Jiricek would really thrive at. And so far, we've seen him kind of in a weird spot, because I think there's been points with Columbus where he's played well, but of course got traded to Minnesota, and I think in that system hasn't really gelled excellently yet, especially in the AHL. He only has 2 assists and 0 goals in 11 games. I'm willing to give him a lot more patience because going to a new organization with all the expectations there is a lot to deal with. And I still think Jiricek will be a good defenseman in the future, though definitely not as much of a minute eater or as elite as some people might have expected. At least for me and what I've seen out of him, I think some of the issues have been that escaping speed, the skating ability just has not really improved as much as it's needed to. And I think that's something that has especially been a detriment to his defensive game in the North American level. But I think that will get better eventually, and hopefully he'll be able to become an NHLer. If he doesn't, that would be very unfortunate for many. Next up, going on to number 13, and a player that is in a pretty similar spot to where I had him back in the 2022 draft rankings, in Marco Kasper. Of course, now with the Detroit Red Wings, he was picked 8th overall, and I think has turned into just a solid middle 6 player, which is exactly what I saw Kasper being. You can see since he was drafted, he's been playing well in the SHL, in the AHL, and now in the NHL level. I think he's been quite solid, especially in that power play spot for Detroit. He's been a pretty effective player. In 38 games, 4 goals, 7 assists, 11 points. I don't think Kasper's production is ever going to light the world on fire, but what Kasper does with his determination, his drive, his work ethic, his just relentless play, he's just somebody you want to have on the ice every single shift. He'll get good results for you. Nothing spectacular, but I think, again, in this 10 to 15 range, that's a player that you love to have. And for Detroit, he's going to look like a solid player for the future. Again, not overwhelming you, but a solid core piece. Next up at number 12, we're going to go on to another player that was kind of around this range for me back in 2022, in Jonathan Likuramaki of the Vancouver Canucks. He was drafted 15th overall. I think he's looking like a pretty good pick there, especially with his goal scoring ability and his knack for the net. He's somebody that I think will be very valuable for Vancouver. I don't think they've really utilized him all too well this year, but he's somebody that you can see in the AHL and the NHL has just been a rocket. I mean, 12 goals in 21 games, 17 points, Lekka Uramaki's offense, his opportunistic style, especially on the rush, is what he's going to be used most for. You're not going to see much defense out of him or physical play. What Lekka Uramaki does best, he is so good at it, and I think he'll be a valuable middle six power play option for Vancouver for a long time. Now at number 11, we're going to go to a player that has slipped a little bit in draft rankings, but is more along the range where we saw him in the draft, in Frank Nazar of the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, he's somebody that has always been a fascinating case in terms of the skill set, the speed. There's been so much with Nazar that is just so fun to watch. The question was, will that be able to translate? And that is still a little bit of a question mark. You can see in the AHL this year, I think he's done spectacularly. With Rockford in 21 games, he has 11 goals, 13 assists for 24 points. He's been spectacular down there. I think at the NHL level, even though there's been some growing pains here and there, in his limited role, I think he's actually shown some pretty good things, using his pace, using his vision in a creative way, and that's always what I wanted to see out of him. We'll see how much he's able to push up that lineup, but I think there is still potential for him to be a top sixer and to be what Chicago drafted him to be. Now, I did mention that we have a lot of prospects on this list that haven't yet made the NHL completely full-time, and this is one of the prospects that hasn't even been signed yet, but I'm still very confident in them being an impact player, in Jimmy Snuggerud of the St. Louis Blues. In fact, I think Snuggerud has been one of the prospects on this list that has turned things around from his draft year the most. In his draft year, I thought he was more of a Swiss Army knife, some more of a defensive player. What Snuggerud has been able to do in Minnesota has been otherworldly. His offense has been at a great level consistently throughout his tenure in college. You can see his freshman season, 50 points in 40 games. This year, 30 points in 24 games. I think the playmaking, we've seen him focus on that more throughout the years, especially this season. I mean, that has taken leaps and bounds over what it has been, but that goal scoring ability, that shot is really what's most important in Snuggerud's case. He's going to be a lethal scorer and somebody I think with his all-around game will really be able to play well in the NHL level and fit pretty perfectly on that Blues top six. Somebody that will feast in the power play, but even strength I think will provide all-around effort that will be commendable and very important for the Blues. Now we go on to a player that I think is pretty similar to Snuggerud in terms of what they were in their draft year and turning it around offensively in a major way. Let's go into the Buffalo Sabres at 9th overall with Yuri Kulik, who I think has been a very big success for them, coming as a 28th overall pick. He's somebody that is just all throughout his time after his draft has just been dominant. You can see right after in the AHL, just putting up unreal numbers, 46 points in 62 games, great numbers again the next year. And then this year, we've seen him back and forth between the NHL and AHL level, but I think he's looked very good for the Sabres in a more limited role. You can see in 31 games, the production isn't unbelievable, but 7 goals, 2 assists, and 9 points. I think he's been fitting very well, though, in that Sabres lineup. There have been times here and there where he's a little bit disengaged and times where you want to see a little bit more out of him. But in terms of that shooting ability, in terms of what he can do in the offensive zone, Kulik has just so much potential there and is somebody that I think will be a difference maker for the Sabres, even if, again, the disappointment of the season looms over him. But he was another player like Snuggerud that back in his draft year was a lot more of a defensive player, a lot more of an overall presence. And even though that is still kind of there for Buffalo, the goal scoring ability, that offense is what Kulik is going to be getting the most money for. Now, at number 8, we're going to go on to just the second defenseman of this list so far, but a lot more to come, I assure you. At number 8, let's go on to the New Jersey Devils and Seamus Casey. Now, this is a player that I liked a lot in his draft year, somebody that I had as a first-round pick, and I think at 46th overall was just a perfect pick for the Devils on day 2. I think with Casey, his offensive potential was getting a little bit underrated. With the puck on his stick, he is somebody that has so much confidence and ability to break the ice with his handling and with his creativity, and that was something that I think we saw back in 2022 in the NTDP, and I think what we've seen throughout Michigan and now in the NHL and AHL, Casey has just done so much to make everybody a believer. You can see in the AHL too of Utica in 17 games, 2 goals, 14 points. I think he's looked very good at the AHL level, and when he has played in the NHL, put up some fantastic numbers, and I thought looked great for the Devils as well. 3 goals, 4 points in 8 games. I think Casey's going to fit as this great all-around offensive defenseman on your top 4, and is somebody that I am just so excited to see on that Devils defense. There's just so much potential there, and even though he got a limited amount of games this year, I think next year we'll see him really explode. I think for some other prospects in this draft, they're in the AHL because they deserve to be there. In Casey's case, I think it's just because of the Devils defense being so deep that he hasn't gotten that opportunity yet, but once he does, I think he is going to fly away with it. Next up to another defenseman here at number 7, we're going to go to a guy that's kind of been in a weird spot, and that's Pavel Mintyukov of the Anaheim Ducks. He was a 10th overall pick by the Ducks, and I think has looked pretty good since then, but has also been up and down. You can see in his rookie season in the NHL, I thought he had some pretty great moments. 28 points in 63 games, I thought was looking and really trending in a great direction, especially after making the NHL, which was a surprise then. But this year has been a different story for him. In 36 games, he has 9 points, is only on pace for 18 points, a pretty big step back from last year, and also has just not looked as confident or as consistent as he was last year, which even then he had some defensive problems here and then. But I think in Mintyukov's case, he's kind of figuring out what he wants to be at the NHL level. If he's going to be more of an offensive defenseman, going to be more of a defensive guy. He's kind of been up and down in those categories. And I still think with Mintyukov, there's a lot of potential and ways to turn him into a great defenseman no matter what you do with him. But in the Ducks case, I think their lack of direction has hurt a couple of players, and in Mintyukov's case especially, has hurt him. Still though, I am a believer in him, which is why he's at number 7, but I think if this was maybe a year ago, he would have been higher for sure. Now, just outside the top 5, we're going to go to another player and another defenseman like Mintyukov that is kind of having a hard time adjusting to the NHL level, and that is Simon Nemec. Now, this is an interesting one. Of course, the second overall pick by New Jersey back in 2022, and he's somebody that has kind of been up and down throughout the last couple of years. You can see last year playing mostly in the NHL level and 19 points. I thought he looked pretty solid. This year, though, I think we've seen some major steps back. Whenever I seen him in the NHL level, he just did not look like the same player on offense, and defensively hadn't really seen much improvement. And you can see in the AHL level, he's been fine, he's been solid, but not really much of an upgrade over what we saw last year where he got 8 points in 13 games. This year, 11 points in 22 games, hasn't quite been at the same impact level, and I'm a little bit concerned, I won't lie. I think in Mets' case, he's best when the confidence is high, when he's able to control the offensive zone, when he's able to have space, and I think so far in the NHL, there's been a big, of course, increase in pressure, a big increase in the lack of space. And I think in the Mets' case, he's really having a hard time adjusting to that. We'll see if it ends up happening in the future. I'm still a believer in him. That's why he's 6th here. But I think in the Mets' case, he isn't quite as impactful as maybe the Devils expect him to be. Now on to the 5th place position, and a player that, even though he struggled quite a bit to start out this year, I think is going to be just fine for the Ducks in the future, and that is Cutter Gauthier, who was drafted 5th overall by Philadelphia and is now, of course, in the 5th spot for the Ducks. Of course, we can talk about the Ducks and Flyers stuff. We've already talked about that a ton on this channel and that trade, of course. But in Gauthier's case, he's going to be a solid top 6 player and a solid top 6 winger for the Ducks for a long time. Using that physical edge, using that versatility on the rush, he's going to be a great player. Has been for Boston College, and I think so far has had a pretty solid role for the Ducks. 20 points in 44 games. Not spectacular production or anything, but he's getting his feet under him again, and I think especially over these last couple weeks, has looked a lot more confident and a lot more consistent. Even though that game versus Philadelphia was not the greatest, he responded with a 2-goal game right after that. I think he'll be just fine. I just desperately need Anaheim to figure this out, man, because so many of these younger players deserve to be so much better than they have been. I just don't think Greg Crone is the answer, but that's a different video for a different time. Now we're going to go just outside the top 3 here at number 4, and going on to a player, if we're going from a player like Cutter Gauthier, who comes into the 5th spot, was drafted 5th overall, let's go into the player in the 4th spot who was drafted 4th overall in Shane Wright of the Seattle Kraken. Now, it seems like the patience has paid off. Even though he's gone from the AHL and at points has been a little bit of an inconsistent player, we saw what he was able to do at the second half last year, really turn it on, and in 59 games, get 47 points, and I thought it looked pretty great in the playoffs, over a point per game, 13 points in 12 games there. And now you can see what that patience has done for him and what he's been this season. Even though the production isn't unbelievable or anything, 21 points in 42 games, you just gotta watch him, man, because he is a different player. He's so much more like we saw out of the OHL in his draft year, where even though there was some inconsistencies there, the speed and the vision and the defensive work ethic, there was just so much with Shane Wright to love back in his draft year, and we've seen that translate now onto the NHL. The goal scoring was really the big thing that's always been good at the NHL level for him, but even though that's been solid for him, I think the creativity has been starting to show. The confidence has been starting to show. He's so much more of a physical player now, winning board battles and being able to drive the net. That's something that I think has been especially important for him to learn at the NHL level, and he has. Sure, the production isn't great, but he's on a horrible Seattle team, not really getting many minutes, and I think that should be changing very soon. He might not be the 1st overall pick that we wanted him to be, but in Shane Wright's case, he's still a good player that deserves your respect. Now, before we get into the top 3, I did want to give some honorable mentions out to guys that just missed the list. Honestly, from like 10 to 25, there are so many names that you could have included, and I could absolutely see why. You got Matthew Poitras, who has looked really good since his draft year, really showcasing that IQ and that consistency on the rush. You can see in the AHL has put up some pretty good numbers, even though the hype, especially to start out last year in the NHL, I don't think is going to be quite as met. He's still going to be a solid middle 6 center and somebody the Bruins will love to have. You got Owen Beck, who has really played well since his draft year. I loved him back in 2022, and he's somebody that I think could potentially be in your top 15. Was close to making it for me, especially with how solid he's been in the AHL level, being a leader for Laval, really bringing that all-around game and showcasing it at the NHL level, or at the AHL level. He's going to be somebody that I think is going to just be the perfect third-line center for you, and somebody that just has so much to give there. I also love Liam Ogren and what he's been able to do in the AHL level. Not extraordinary numbers or anything, but 20 points in 24 games. I've loved him whenever I've seen him there, and I thought he looked okay at the NHL level too. Kevin Korchinski is somebody that I debated having on this list. I was never a huge fan of him. He was more so in the 15 to 20 range for me, and I don't really see anything of what he's shown to negate that for me. I always saw some pretty big defensive concerns. We saw that in droves last year. I think we're seeing it again in the NHL and AHL level this year. I just don't think Korchinski is going to be the top 10 pick Chicago wanted, but still a solid offensive power play, second pair D. I just don't think Korchinski's going to live up to that seventh overall hype. You also got Denton Mateychuk as an offensive D. He was to be also in the 15 to 25 range. I debated having on this list. The pace and the creativity has always been there. I think we've still seen some of the defensive concerns, especially physically at the NHL level, but what he's been able to do at the AHL has just been outstanding, and I think he will become a solid D for the Blue Jackets. And then a couple of last forwards to mention here. Danil Yurov is somebody that's always been an underrated prospect. I think just will fill out kind of like Owen Beck into that third line center role, bringing some opportunistic offense, really feeding all of his play from the defensive habits and the instincts he has there. It's what he's been doing in the KHL for a long time now. I think he will continue to do so. And the last player I want to mention here in the honorable mentions is Isaac Howard. He won't get a lot of talk, but of course we talked about Jimmy Snuggerud a few spots back. In Howard's case, he has been electrifying for Michigan State. I think has been the driver in every single way there. You look at a rebound season in Charlie Stramel, Isaac Howard, I think, is the reason for that. The creativity, the vision, the pace, the speed, it's all been unreal. And I think he's been one of the best players in the NCAA this year. Top 5, in my opinion. He has been unbelievable. And I think deserves a lot of respect going forward. He's going to be a critical part of that Tampa Bay offense. And I think one that'll come here pretty soon. Now, getting us started inside the top 3 here, we have Juraj Slafkovsky, who I think is kind of in an island of his own in terms of the tiers here, because I think Slafkovsky isn't close to number 2, but I also don't think he's very close to number 4. I think the potential he still brings is enticing, but he's somebody that has had his inconsistencies at the NHL level, especially with the offense and the actual pace of his play. I think there have been concerns throughout the years. You could see last year, though, the second half that we saw got him up to 50 points in 82 games. This year is on a similar trajectory, but especially the goal scoring has taken a massive step back. Some of that is due to luck, but some of that I just think is Slafkovsky not shooting as much as he should, not really being the driver that I think he can be. He can really use his size to drive the net if he wanted to, but I think he's a little bit too passive, and I think that's something that has really stalled his point production. I think he'll still be a solid player and something that will be a valuable top 6 piece, but somebody that I think you want to see more out of almost every single time, and unfortunately might be a little bit of a frustrating piece. Still a good one, but maybe not an elite one. But now, of course, that gets us on to the top 2. And this is the reason why I'm on to make this video now, because I think this has gotten extremely interesting. Because I think you have a top 2 solidified here between Lane Hutson and Logan Cooley. And you could go between either of these 2 players, and I could absolutely see why. Really, the question is, what do you want? Do you want a first-line center, or do you want a top pair D-man? That's really the big question here. Which player do you prefer? Which player you think has lesser weaknesses? And who do you see being the better player in the end? To me, I think it's between these 2 players that have really projected themselves outside of everybody else in this 2022 draft as the guys in the draft class. And you can see the production of these 2 guys. At 20 years old, both of them have been spectacular in the NHL this year. In Lane Hutson's case, as a rookie, 35 points, 32 assists in 43 games, the most pass completions in the NHL this year to the slot as a D. It's unbelievable what Hutson has been able to do, especially over the last couple of months. But you also got Logan Cooley, who is somebody that I think has been a driver of play for Utah. And in the offensive aspect, I think will be a critical center in the NHL going forward. To me, a top 10 one with his creativity, with the playmaking he has. He's somebody that I think will be an elite centerman as well. Really, you could go either way, and again, I wouldn't blame you either way. But if I had to pick a number 2, I think I would just by a slight, tiny margin pick Lane Hutson. And it's not because he hasn't been spectacular this year. And you can even make the case he's been more impactful this year than Logan Cooley. I'm just thinking long-term of who I'd rather prefer. I think Logan Cooley has slightly less weaknesses than Lane Hutson, even though he's been fantastic this year. I don't think Hutson is ever going to be this extraordinary defensive player or anything, and I think there will be holes, at least with his physicality, that hold him back in ways, but still, I think he's been aggressive and has been able to make up for it in special ways this year. And again, the production, what he's been able to do on the power play, what he's been able to do with his all-around game has just been spectacular this year. For a lot of people that have doubted him, a lot of people are saying that his, Corey Pruttman just recently saying that his compete is average. Everything that has been labeled against Hutson, we talked about this last week in a video with him, has been wrong. Even I had him as a early second rounder, and that is looking absolutely silly looking back on it. he was somebody that I think has improved on his skating so much, has improved on his confidence and his consistency in the offensive zone. And I think he is so much more of a complete player than what we saw in his draft year. And that's, of course, credit to him, who has worked so hard to be able to prove everybody wrong. And so far he has. The sky's the limit. And if he does end up becoming the best player of this draft, I don't think I'm surprised. And I don't think you should be either, because the sky's the limit for this guy. And he is just so fun to watch with Montreal. Put all of your anti-Habs bias aside, just watch this guy play, man, and you're gonna have so much fun. And that's what hockey's about. But now coming in at number 1, and by a slim, tiny, again, I want to stress, tiny margin. At number 1, I do have Logan Cooley, and this is for a few reasons. With what I've seen before, and of course what I've seen since this draft year, I think Cooley has been the least flawed player out of this draft class, out of anybody. And to me, I think we've seen that perform well in his time with Utah. You can see in 82 games last year, 20 goals, 44 points. And this year, we've seen him turn it on to another level, using that creativity in a special way. And I think just being a driver in so many ways. To me, he is going to become one of the best centers in the league. And for me personally, I think that's a little bit more important than what Lane Hudson is. I think especially with some of the defensive deficiencies, you're going to have to make up for Lane Hudson in ways in the future. In Cooley's case, though, he is going to make every single player better. He is going to be a franchise face in every single way. And I don't really have any doubt that Cooley will become that type of guy. That to me is what pushes him to number 1, especially. But again, if you went Hudson, I could understand that. In Cooley's case, though, I think he is just a dynamic player that cannot be missed in any way, and a great pick at 3rd overall. But hey, if we're talking about players that raise their stock the most, Lane Hudson is absolutely number 1, despite Logan Cooley's play. Going from a late 2nd, almost early 3rd round pick to 2nd overall is a heck of an accomplishment, and I think Habs fans should be still in love with that. Going from a 2nd round pick to one of the best prospects in the draft, that's pretty unbelievable. But I want to know your thoughts in the comments down below on what you guys think about this 2022 draft almost 3 years later. Who do you think has risen up the most for you? Who do you think has fallen the most for you? And of course, what would your top 3, top 5 look like? And who would you prefer over Cooley and Hudson? Let me know all your thoughts down below. Of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And click on this card, of course, for all my 2025 draft content for you guys to binge right in one playlist. I will see you guys in the next one, though, and have a fantastic hockey day. Goodbye.